this religious nation state, this Panchasila variety of state, society, state, religion relations that emphasizes religion is a public good, and it is entirely proper that state actors interact with civil society, with religious society actors, so as to create a culture of piety. Yes. And that, of course, for some Western secular liberals is a threshold that's unacceptable. But that is the threshold or the course to which Indonesians commit themselves. So I always encourage my Western friends, particularly those who are dyed-in-the-wool secularists, to look a little bit more closely and recognize that this formula, rather than being bad for democracy, is actually one of the true secrets of Indonesian democracy and Indonesian civic tolerance.
Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar, your host, and today with us we have Professor Robert Hefner of the Boston University. He is, in my opinion, and I'm sure in the opinion of most scholars of the discipline, one of the most important anthropologists who studies the Muslim world, especially the Southeast Asia, and he is easily one of the most prominent scholars of Indonesia, Islam in Indonesia, and also to a great extent how Islam is implemented or how Sharia is implemented in many parts of the Muslim world. I often use some of Professor Hefner's books. This is one that I often use, and I have used this quite often in my PhD seminars, and students love it because it gives them a good overview of Muslim efforts to try and implement Islamic law with its medieval origins in the modern world. So welcome to Khanversations, Professor Hefner.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Today we are going to talk about, the conversation is triggered by an article that was recently published in The Economist, which says that Indonesia is trying to export its version of moderate Islam to the rest of the world. My instant reaction was, so have they triumphed at home? Was my first question that I thought. So has moderate Islam completely dominates Indonesian politics today, so that now they are ready to export? Because if you remember, when the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, one of the reasons why the Iran-Iraq War probably happened was because of the attempt of the Iranians to export their revolution into the Middle East. So Professor, without much ado, I often forget this. To those who are watching for the first time, please do the needful. Subscribe to the channel Khanversations, ring the bell icon, and like this video. So do you think that moderate Islam is now like the default Islam of Indonesia?
I'm going to go considerably beyond the bounds of scholarly caution and respond in a very simple way and say yes. What's happened in Indonesia over the past, not just the past 2 years, although the past 2 years have been critical, but really over the past 5 or 6 years, has been the ascendance of a much better, a much more doctrinally and jurisprudentially elaborated understanding of what Indonesians, particularly those associated with Nahdlatul Ulama, the 70 to 90 million strong Muslim mass organization that is leading the humanitarian Islam movement. So there's this, in all ways, this effort to forge and disseminate a vision of Islam that is humanitarian has gained momentum and ascendance in the Indonesian society. Needless to say, there are not the Muhammadiyah, which is typically referred to as a modernist Muslim mass organization and has an extraordinary array of higher educational institutions, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 170 colleges and universities. It's there as well. It's adopted a somewhat lower profile as regards its role in the international sphere, and it has not embraced all of the ideas that Nahdlatul Ulama is promoting. but these two organizations are themselves, I tend not to use the term moderate Islam, but since we're using it and since both groups, both organizations use it, I will use it here. Both groups self-identify as moderate, and there is no question that these two organizations, not least of all Nahdlatul Ulama, are the dominant varieties of Islam in Indonesia today. It is a transformative moment in Indonesian Muslim society and in Indonesian Muslim politics.
A few years ago, Professor, I edited a book called Debating Moderate Islam, and I brought in a lot of scholars. It was more of an intellectual exercise rather than an empirical work. And we debated the idea of what would be a moderate Islam if we talked about it as moderate Islam. And there is a lot of resistance among Muslims, but in particular, Muslim scholars, to use the word moderate Islam. You know, there's at least the traditional, if you go to the masjid, the alims in the masjid and ordinary practicing Muslims, they often insist that there's no radical Islam, no moderate Islam, there's only one Islam. So either you're on the straight path or you're off the straight path. And so the way I used to engage on that issue was I would ask the simple question, is bin Laden a Muslim? And very few people would ever tell me that he's not a Muslim. And then I would say, is there any difference between you and him? I mean, do you subscribe to everything that bin Laden says? Are you like ready to become or eligible to be an Al-Qaeda member today? And then they would repel against that idea and say, no, I'm not like him. And then I said, that's the difference, right? That's what we are talking. What is the difference between you and Al-Qaeda? What's the difference between an average practicing Muslim who goes to the mosques and stuff? So this idea that there is a moderate interpretation of Islamic sources, for some reasons, most Muslims seem to reject that idea because the assumption is that Islam in itself is modern and moderate and so on. So how come these two groups who are traditional groups, right, in their methodology, are able to use the term and also, you know, make it popular in Indonesia?
Well, let me say from my own point of view that I fully share that opinion about the unhelpfulness and in potential misrepresentation that's associated with the term moderate Islam. And in fact, when I talk about these two major currents of Islamic mass social organizations, Muhammadiyah, and again, especially, most notably, the Nahdlatul Ulama, I refer to them, I emphasize 2 points. One is that both of these organizations underscore that they're not, if they use the term democracy, plurality, or moderation, they're not referring to matters of doctrine or aqidah, basic theology and worldview. They, as far as, let me again focus on the humanitarian Islam project of Nahdlatul Ulama, which has truly become a global initiative. They make clear, and I've had this conversation with Kiai Haji Yahya Khalil Stakov, who's the executive director of Nahdlatul Ulama, and a man I know well. He makes clear that they're not talking about matters of Aqidah, and they share the view that as a religion, Islam is a religion of moderation. What they also believe, however, is that there have, as social movements are concerned, not matters of Aqidah, but with regards to matters of social movements that reference or self-identify as Muslim or Islamic, there's a great variation. And there has been a tendency in recent years, both the Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah leadership emphasize for certain fringe groups to attempt to position themselves to represent themselves as the true voice of Islam. So that what we see in Indonesia is not, if you will, I believe, a kind of an effort to position Indonesia as moderate Islam, but an effort to present Indonesian Muslims as taking exception to the efforts of small fringe groups to speak for and thereby misrepresent the Muslim world community as a whole. So it's not a matter of aqidah. It's a matter of Muslim self-representation and then communication to the broader non-Muslim community.
You know, we have seen such movements. I mean, before the Gulenists were accused and probably got involved in the coup against Erdogan, they were also seen as, you know, this enlightened Islam. If you know, Professor Hakan Yavuz wrote the book about enlightened Islam and how
Yes.
the Gulenists were practicing education and enlightenment, etc., worldwide. And in Egypt also, if you're familiar with the Al-Wasatiyya party, I mean, the word migration and the middle path comes from the verse of the Quran, which uses the word Al-Wasat, Ummat al-Wasat. So that the Muslims are a moderate community. These movements have clearly failed. I mean, the Gulenist movement is completely discredited in Turkey, and Al-Wasat, after the success of, after the removal of Mubarak, more or less kind of merged with the Muslim Brotherhood and participated in trying to build a new government. But what is it about the Indonesian resurgence, should we say, or secularization or modernization in the past few years, where we see a clear marked movement away from radicalism? And if you remember the explosions in Bali, the bomb attacks, there are people who would openly say, I am with some of these radical groups, including ISIS in Indonesia. But now we see that there are two important since you have said that they don't believe it's an Aqidah thing, but they seem to have kind of raised it as an Aqidah issue, or at least saying that in Indonesia, especially the Nahdlatul Ulama, not only embrace the nation state, but also reject the idea of the caliphate. You know, so there is this marked movement away. What is the reason for this? Is there a dissatisfaction with all the violence that is coming from these radical groups, or is it some kind of an, shall we say, reformist development of the Indonesian Muslim society?
Well, I think the most striking thing about this new development in Indonesia is that it isn't really new. I was a good friend, of course, of the late Abdurrahman Wahid, who passed away in 2008, but a man who was a great leader of Nahdlatul Ulama, and from the mid-1980s onward had redirected Nahdlatul Ulama in a direction that embraced. This is at a time when Indonesia itself was under the control of the authoritarian President Suharto. But from the heart of this very well-controlled national politics, Gus Dur, Abdurrahman Wahid, he was called Gus Dur, and Nahdlatul Ulama positioned themselves not as radical opponents. They eschewed violence and indeed never engaged in violence. It was truly impressive, but promoted the idea in a network of some 40,000 Islamic boarding schools that they control, promoted the idea that Islam and democracy, Islam and international human rights are compatible. Now, it doesn't mean that all aspects of human rights, for example, those that have to do with those that are current,
the LGBTQ issues, right?
But in matters of basic human rights, democracy, this movement has deep roots. It has great precedence, and it has, in many ways, I think, never faltered. What's faltered, or what's at times been a little bit more difficult, was the process of democratization itself. But the transition to democracy began, and return to democracy began in May 1998 with the fall of the Suharto regime, and then the return under the auspices of NU and again Muhammadiyah. These were the two pillars of the democratic transition. And rather than that democratic transition losing steam, it gained momentum and, above all, participated in the consolidation of democracy. It's not a perfect democracy, but that has not very little to do with Muslim politics per se, and it has instead to do with fundamental socioeconomic inequalities that mark Indonesia, much as is the case across Southeast Asia. But the economy is booming, and social justice issues are very much foregrounded. And again, this is not a recent trend. This is something, this is the culmination of a 30-year plus initiative. And it is impressive and unique among Muslim democratic movements in this regard.
One of the things, I mean, Indonesia is now a rising country. If you look at the economic forecasts, which 20 years from now, 15 years from now, you can see that Indonesia is predicted to become the fourth biggest economy in the world. You know, China, India, US, and then Indonesia. It is also a pretty big country, probably the fourth largest in terms of population, close to 300 million. Also the biggest Muslim country. So it is simultaneously, you see not only economic development, I mean, but also democratization taking place in Indonesia. And if you remember the early debates about compatibility of Islam and democracy, one of the issues that was often raised was the lack of civil society in the Middle Eastern countries, and the absence of civil society meant that the civil society is weak, and therefore it is difficult to approve authoritarianism. Uh, do you think that these movements, especially Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, essentially constitute the civil society of Indonesia?
Unambiguously, yes. These are organizations that have rooted themselves in Indonesian society for the better part of a century, indeed a full century. Their ideological vision has changed. They've engaged democracy much more exuberantly since the 1970s and 1980s. Indonesia, as I think most of your listeners know, had a difficult time in the first years after independence. Independence was declared in 45. It was achieved after an independent struggle in 49. And then during the next decade, actually the next 15 years, Indonesia was torn between an Indonesian Communist Party, which was the largest in the non-communist world, and most basically Muslim social welfare organizations, and Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah in particular, and their party affiliates. So that in the aftermath, there was a coup attempt by the people broadly sympathetic to the Communist Party in 1965. If one looked at Indonesia in 1966-67, it looked like the least likely country, Muslim majority country in the world to effect a successful transition to democracy. But it did. And it began very quickly. And it did so because, again, it had these civil society rooted mass organizations, both of which provided a kind of steady state equilibrium in matters of education, social welfare services, and I should add, Indonesia is remarkable in the prominence, size, and effectiveness of its Muslim women's organizations. These are equally impressive. All of those were put in place. They didn't perhaps Indonesia was still quite poor in the 1970s. They didn't have the resources, didn't have the educated middle class, but slowly but surely you added a highly educated Muslim middle class to these organizations, so that by the mid-1980s and above all the 1990s, you have a securely based Muslim civil society grounded in these two pillars of civil society organization, but now also benefiting from an educational transformation that really transformed the way in which Indonesians, all Muslims as well as non-Muslims represent 12% of the Indonesian population, the whole country changed. But that was a major contributor. It provided, if you will, a kind of space in which Indonesian Muslims themselves began to explore much more self-confidently ideas of Islam and democracy, Islam and human rights. And that's what brought us forward to today.
You know, what you're saying is, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that there is democracy in Indonesia, not in spite of Islam and Islamic movements, but essentially primarily because of Islamic movements that we see a democratization of Indonesia. Would that be correct?
It would, yes. The transition to democracy in 1998-99 would not have been possible without what many people, and I include myself here, refer to as these two pillars of civil society. Now, one final kind of adjustment to this characterization. One of the more remarkable features of civil society organization in Indonesia, mass-based organizations have spawned a plethora of independent think tanks, autonomous bodies, institutes, most of which maintain a formal institutional autonomy from these two mass organizations, some of which include, again, the very significant 12% of the population, non-Muslim population in their ranks. But rather than this being a weakness or vulnerability, the proliferation of think tanks, of newspapers, of journals, of centers of Islamic and democratic thought, Muslim and non-Muslim, this proliferation that again dates from the 90s, but really accelerates intensively in the 2000s with the return to democracy. It too is part of the kind of genius of this Indonesian dynamism, this ability to go of the two mass organizations to work with and then spawn a remarkable array of institutes, centers, and social movements, smaller social movements.
For those who are not familiar with these organizations, Nahdlatul Ulama is probably the biggest Muslim organization, membership organization, with close to 100 million members, and Muhammadiyah is about 20 to 30 million members. And what is also interesting is that both of them, I think Nahdlatul Ulama is celebrating its 100th year. This year has it's been since February 1923. And the Muhammadiyah movement is even older, I think 1912. There is this issue of the impact of external aspects of Muslim ideas on Indonesia. One of our grad students at the University of Delaware, who now is my colleague and he teaches at the university and we work on several programs together, studied what he called as internal Islamophobia and looked at the demonization of the Ahmadiyyas, the Qadianis, he talks about the impact of the Pakistani ideas and Pakistani discrimination of Ahmadiyyas relocating to Indonesia and how it shows that even within the movements. So we see also an impact of outside. So like in preparation for this, I was watching some radical groups were arguing that to rejecting the idea of the Khilafah in preference to a nation state is apostasy, and they were saying they are murtads. So has the impact of the Wahhabi wave, which kind of radicalized Muslims all over the world, these Salafi Wahhabi ideas, is that still there in Indonesia, or is it receding, partly because Saudi Arabia itself is reforming now, and partly because of the excitement of the new ideas that are coming from Nahdlatul Ulama?
We have good survey data. Indonesia is unusual in this regard, in as much as there's a long history of really fine survey work, the best of it, incidentally, done by Muslim scholars like Syaiful Mujani in Jakarta. And they've done polling over a long period of time. And most of our polls indicate that about 8% of the Indonesian Muslim public, not the population as a whole, self-identify, if asked in a detailed way, to respond to certain questions that are designed to elicit, if you will, a Salah profile. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 8% of the Indonesian public self-identifies with positions that are those of Salafism. Now, that said, what's interesting about even this, and then about, I should say, about an additional 12% might be thought of as very different, but let's call them broadly Muslim Brotherhood. So you have about 20% combined Salafi and Muslim Brotherhood, and I don't mean to cast aspersions at all at either of those two communities, global communities, certainly not least the Muslim Brotherhood, which has suffered so greatly in recent years in countries like Egypt. But that said, the great majority of people in Indonesia retain a commitment to, again, a variety of Islamic politics. In matters of aqidah, there's uh, uh, mainstream Sunnis, mainstream, very proud of that. The Shia community, as you probably know, is tiny in Indonesia. It's probably about 1% of the population. But in any case, proud self-identification as Sunnis, but self-identifying their Sunnism in such a way as to underscore its compatibility with multi-religious nationalism. That doesn't mean liberal nationalism. We can talk about that if you wish. Not liberal in the Western, contemporary Western sense. So but a strong self-identification with multi-religious nationalism rather than a caliphate or an Islamic state, and a strong self-identification with democracy and inclusive citizen plurality, which is to say a citizenship that does not, in a majoritarian way, differentiate Muslims from non-Muslims, but embraces the idea that all citizens of all faiths should have a. Now, if we go into the survey data, I actually, a few years ago, completed a survey of 2,000 Muslim educators. And if you break down the questions in a certain way and pose them in a different way, you'll find that it's 84% of the public and the Muslim educational community who commit themselves to this Indonesian variety of multi-religious pluralism. But if you probe a little bit further and say, well, is it acceptable to have a Christian governor in a city like Jakarta, which of course Indonesia did have, a Chinese Christian governor, there the numbers drop a little bit. So you see there's elements of tension and friction, but in general, this commitment to a multi-religious nationalism and the compatibility of Islam with pluralist democracy, not just majoritarian, but a pluralist democracy, is very, very secure. It is a trademark of Muslim politics and culture in Indonesia.
I'm not as intimately familiar with Indonesia as you are, but I did travel in Jakarta, Yogyakarta, and also went to Bali. And the Bali is 10% Muslim only, and it is an integral part of Indonesia. It's an island, but the acceptance of other religions that you can clearly see is manifest in so remarkably in the island of Bali, which is also quite popular for tourism. As a result of that, it is probably richer than some of the other provinces in Indonesia. Indonesia, to me, it appears that it is kind of like the inverse of India. India is about 80% or 85% Hindu and about 14% Muslim. And then you have Indonesia, which is about 90% Muslim and then has about 10% or less other populations, Christians. So dealing with pluralism is inevitable. Pluralism is impossible. Look at the US or everywhere now. All societies have become multi-ethnic, multiracial, and even multi-religious communities. And we see religious resurgence in various other communities too. So it's not just that there is an Islamic resurgence. There is a Hindu revivalism going on in India. We see Christian revivalism in certain parts of the Christian world. So in all of this, the transformative movements that we see in this world, I think, would you say that Indonesia's experience with secularism is quite remarkable, even comparable to, say, what Turkey or, for that matter, Tunisia's experience with secular has been? You could argue that to some extent, both Tunisia and Turkey have moved away from their secular past, whereas Indonesia seems to be becoming more secular, even though it has such deep Islamic roots.
Secularism, of course, has many meanings. The late Al Stepan, a political scientist at Columbia University, was a friend of mine, and he wrote on the multiplicity of secularisms around the world, including in Europe, where there's not one variety of secularism. But he was particularly intrigued in the last years of his life with the varieties of secularisms that we find in the Muslim world. And among Muslim countries, he was perhaps most intrigued and fascinated, heartened by what he saw in Indonesia. He spent a good deal of time in Indonesia in the last years of his life. And I traveled to Indonesia with him several times. So I had the pleasure of both introducing him and then also having him look at Indonesia and Indonesian secularism in a certain way. So yes, I would say, but I would put it this way. I actually, because secularism can mean so many things, and it can carry a certain stigmatization. And indeed, some varieties of secularism I am deeply uncomfortable with myself.
Yeah.
I prefer to say, okay, what is the nature of religion-state relations in Indonesia? Yes, there is a separation of state authority from religious authorities, number one, and that's what we typically associate with secularism. But there are also, to use the phrase, extensive collaborations, imbrications across the state-society divide, beginning with the state ideology, the Pancasila, or 5 principles, the first of which emphasizes that Indonesia is not a secular state in the contemporary Western liberal sense, which I would add, the contemporary Western liberal sense is not the sense that Westerners themselves used to have. We have Westerners that become much, not only secular, but in some ways, a certain portion of them hostile to religion.
Yeah.
So, but in Indonesia, you have a variety, a state, society, religion that has always committed itself to the idea that religion, but not any single religion, but all of the religions recognized. Currently, there are 6, and then a 7th category of small indigenous religions are also now recognized. All of these religious traditions are seen as not, if you will, something to be separated from the state, but as critical resources for national development. So the state commits itself to religious education, and most communities, there are a few dissident, hard Western style secularists, but it's striking, very few. Most people, including the Christian community, which is about 10%, 9%, 10% of the population, but disproportionately influential because Christians, not to the degree we see in some parts of the Middle East like Lebanon, but the Christians are well educated and a little more affluent. They're also than your average Indonesian. Christians in Eastern Indonesia are poor, so there's a lot of variety there. But the Christian community is very comfortable with this religious nation state, this Pancasila variety of state, society, state, religion relations that emphasizes religion is a public good, and it is entirely proper that state actors interact with civil society, with religious society actors, so as to create a culture of piety. Yes. And that, of course, for some Western secular liberals is a threshold that's unacceptable. But that is the threshold or the course to which Indonesians commit themselves. So I always encourage my Western friends, particularly those who are dyed-in-the-wool secularists, to look a little bit more closely and recognize that this formula, rather than being bad for democracy, is actually one of the true secrets of Indonesian democracy and Indonesian civic tolerance.
I once spent a lot of time with Nurcholish Majid, who's a very prominent Indonesian intellectual. And during those conversations, I think he when I was a grad student at Georgetown, he did visit and speak in the lecture, and I spent a lot of time with him over 3-4 days. And one of the discussions that we had was about this idea of secularism, and it was very interesting. His answer was, he says, Muqtedar, don't think of it as Islam versus secularism. Why don't you think of Islamic secularism? And this idea that there is an Islamic secularism is also quite popular in certain intellectual circles in Malaysia. And there is actually a book out there by a very prominent Malaysian scholar called Islamic Secularism. So in that sense, if you define the idea of secularism as essentially separation of the institution of the state and religious institutions, then to a great extent, you could argue that it is true. But if you start defining it as separation of values itself, uh, then the state is now in conflict with the values of the masses in the country itself. So if the whole population is practicing certain set of values, and then the state is espousing other values, then it becomes quite ridiculous. I want to touch upon the controversy which is currently taking place about one of the schools in Indonesia has started training women imams, and so there is
Yes.
this discussion of blasphemy accusations against him. And I don't know whether you are familiar that, but Professor Amna Wadud, after she retired, moved to Indonesia, and she's the original modern day woman imam who led the Friday prayers in New York about 20 years ago. You speak to a little bit to that there are people who are also trying to push the agenda where they want to also, it's like a reformist agenda, especially on the issue of gender roles.
That's a great point, and of course, I know Amina very well and respect her greatly. I didn't know that she had moved to Indonesia. That's intriguing, and I will look her up next time I'm there. Uh, that said, two things. Indonesia has a long-standing tradition of women ulama, religious scholars, and the both the quantity and the quality of women Islamic scholars have increased greatly over the last 25 to 30 years. Again, coincident with both this greater confidence and cultural you see in the Muslim community, and then at a simpler sociological level, the increase in the quality of education and, if you will, the international horizons of Indonesians. Indonesians didn't used to travel; now they travel and know a good deal about the world. So, in any case, that's the first thing that I would say is that whatever's happening with women imam, and I'll say something about that in a moment, the much larger phenomenon that's there, that's well established, and that excites absolutely no controversy, except perhaps at times among the 8% Salafi community. But even there, I can say this because I've worked and visited, chatted with the Salafi community in Indonesia is unusual to the degree it emphasizes the importance of women's education. So even they, if you will, have if I may use this rather silly phrase, drunk the Kool-Aid of Indonesian Muslim culture. That said, you have this huge community of Muslim scholars, women scholars, and from these ranks, some imams have emerged. Let me just add, I'll end with just one observation. I've had this conversation, indeed quite recently, with some women Muslim scholars, very, very well-respected scholars from Indonesia, and both from NU and from Muhammadiyah, as well as some independent intellectuals. But it's primarily been within the ranks of these two organizations that I very specifically spoken about the question of women imams. And there's a sense that I would say, and I don't want to oversimplify this, there's this majority opinion among women Muslim intellectuals and leaders is that there's no need to make this the foremost issue. This is not the critical issue. The critical issue is one of drawing women into leadership positions generally in Muslim society. And there, it's not just a matter of progress. There's been a wholesale transformation of the way things are done. But as one woman sort of Riley said to me just when I was just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Indonesia for a meeting of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, people of multiple faiths. But the question of women was being raised in general as people talked about. And one of the women, Muslim women, she was from Anu. She looked at me and wryly said, she said, "Look, this isn't the critical issue. We lead women's prayer all the time. We always have. If someone wants to sort of press for women leading mixed gender prayer, okay, but we don't think this is the critical issue." So there would be people who would disagree with her on that, but I think the majority opinion is this is not the important issue is to keep moving forward with women's leadership, women's education, and women's active participation in religious observance, ibadah.
You know, in Toledo, before I moved to Delaware, I used to live in Michigan, and occasionally I would drive down to Toledo and pray in it's a very beautiful mosque called the Petersburg Mosque. It's built on a mountain. If you're driving up I-75, before you reach Toledo, the first thing you see is the mosque. It's quite majestic. And
I've seen it. It's beautiful.
you've seen it, yeah. So the
Yes.
president of that mosque for many years was a woman, and what she used to do was very interesting. That before the Friday sermon, she would address the congregation and she would give a talk and talk about the activities that the mosque is doing. She would do the fundraising. She would talk about critical issues, everything that mattered, except the religious part of the sermon was given by the imam. So, and you can see across, even in the United States now, or even in Singapore, for example, you see women's role in the mosque and Islamic organizations. My experience has been that they are the most sincere workers, and they actually take less pay and do more work more sincerely and bring less politics to institutions than Muslim men do, who are often, engaged in a lot of political activities in their own organizations. One last question, Bob, is some of these people who are talking about these ideas are much, much older people, right? Like, how are the youth? Like, what are the younger people, the 20s and the 30s? I remember interacting for several hours with a large group of young Muslims in Yogyakarta, and it was to me quite fascinating to engage with them. The excitement to learn about Islam, the excitement to engage with the world was quite palpable. So, what is your experience on some of the critical issues of compatibility of Islam and democracy, compatibility of Islam and human rights, and religious pluralism? These are some of the challenges that we are facing. So, where are the youth on this, the general Muslim youth?
Well, the youth in Indonesia, as in the entire world, are quite plural, but the central currents within the Muslim community, Muslim youth community, are very similar. Indeed, show the influence of and engagement with the mainstream Muslim mass organizations, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. Both of those organizations have huge young people's wings, which exercise considerable autonomy. They're not under the kind of supervisory direction of the senior leadership. And I would say the overwhelming majority of Indonesian youth are on the same page as their seniors. I might add here, if I can refer to, Anu, take it as an example, much of the senior leadership in Indonesia is not very old. The current chairman of Nahdlatul Ulama, Kiai Haji Yahya Khalil Stakuf, who is a incredibly original and bold thinker, committed to humanitarian Islam and spreading the message of the compatibility of democracy and human rights with Islam. Gus Yahya, as he's colloquially called, was himself born in 1966. So he's not an old guy, and this is sort of the case as well in Muhammadiyah. There's been a kind of regeneration. So much of your leadership, most of your leadership is in their late 40s and early 1950s. You don't have a gerontocratic leadership in Indonesia. That's not been the pattern for most of Indonesian
that's
history.
the American thing now.
Yeah,
leaders.
but the only kind of final thing that I would say is that so the youth community is diverse, and particularly, I think this is interesting, on the non-religious, rather not the Islamic universities, but on the secular, quote unquote, the nationally organized campuses of universities like Gajah Mada University, where I have ties and go regularly, or the Indonesia University, Universitas Indonesia in Jakarta. Ironically, it's on these campuses where you have perhaps you have the greater, a larger presence. It's not majority, but it's much more noticeable than on the Muslim universities or than in mainstream society. You have a movement that's called the Hijrah movement. And as you can guess from that phrasing, this is a movement that basically makes the case that the varieties, the social styles, not matters of Aqidah, but the social styles of Islam are not sufficiently Islamic, and that on questions of women's leadership and the like, there needs to be a sort of battening down of the hatches, a more conservative, I put that in quotes, conservative expression of Islam. Now, on campuses, we again have good statistical information. This community is much more significantly, much larger, again, on secular campuses. It's about 20 to 25% of the student body. When you go to the state Islamic universities, where you have people who were trained in madrasas, known in Indonesia as pesantren, or trained in Islamic schools like those associated with Muhammadiyah, those numbers drop. And those numbers drop because, again, the youth better trained, more deeply trained from their early childhood in matters of Quranic learning, in matters of not just observance but scholarship. These are the people who tend to be the strongest supporters of this notion of the compatibility of Islam with multi-religious nationalism and democracy. But there is, again, a Hijra movement, particularly on those secular campuses, and that would like to take Indonesia certainly the youth population in a different direction. But they're a minority.
I've been to the Gajah Mada University, and I think a lot of those groups that you're referring to, they learn their Islam from the internet, and it's not something that is they're learning it from organically from their own communities and as it is practices. So they're going to the internet and YouTube and watching imams from other parts of the world, even American imams who sometimes are quite conservative on some of these issues. So Professor Hefner, thank you very much for coming to Khanversations and sharing your knowledge and your wisdom about Indonesia and Islam in Indonesia. I'm looking forward to the ideas and experiences of Indonesian Muslims actually traveling across to other countries, especially Pakistan and the Middle East. And your work and your essays and your books do play a great role in bringing these understandings to classrooms. So thank you very much for coming to Khanversations, and thank you to all of you who have watched the show. And if you are not a subscriber, do remember to subscribe to Khanversations, like the video, and press the bell icon. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Muqtedar. Thank you.